Please welcome Kristina Cahill.
Well, good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the time that I was a volunteer at a cemetery in London, England. The name of the cemetery is Highgate, and it is the best of what remains of Victorian England. It was built in the 1800s, and very many famous people who are buried there are known throughout the world. So my job as a volunteer was pretty simple. I just collected the entrance fee, and I also rang the bell at the end of the night. So the reason for ringing the bell is quite important because you can actually go into the cemetery and walk around for the most part freely, but when it's time to leave, if you don't hear the bell ring or if you don't know what time it is, you get locked in. So I brought this image to show you of the entrance of Highgate Cemetery. You can pass these around as I talk about them. So the gate closes and the walls are quite high. So when you get locked in overnight, sometimes people, what they would do is climb the wall, causing quite a bit of damage and destruction to the old cemetery wall. So as a volunteer, we were able to sort of try to help locate those areas and build them up. And today I just want to take you on a walk through the entire cemetery. As you enter the cemetery, you would see lots of beautiful sculptures and statues such as this one. This is quite typical of a cemetery statue. Very beautiful, but after you walk by the very beginning part of the cemetery, you will find a lot of fallen angels. It's quite overgrown. It's actually known as a garden of peace. When it was built in the 1800s, the Victorians had lots of circuitous pathways and beautiful landscape, but as time went on, World War II happened, the cemetery actually was overgrown, completely engulfed by nature. So these tightly packed gravestones were then covered in moss and ivy and big trees. So this cemetery is actually located in the heart of central London, but you wouldn't know it because you feel like you're in the middle of a forest. And you can kind of get an idea through that image right there. When you enter towards the middle of the cemetery, the most famous person who is buried there is Karl Marx. They built a gigantic sculpture of his head to mark the place where he's buried, and that is shown in this image right here. However, Karl Marx was not everybody's a fan of Karl Marx, so in the 1970s, a group of extremists tried to blow this monument up with explosives. Later, somebody actually succeeded in marking it up with swastikas, cutting off the nose, and then finally somebody did knock the entire head off the plinth, on which it sat. But I found it really interesting to learn as a volunteer that he's not even buried in this location. He's buried farther down into the middle of the cemetery in a very inconspicuous grave, which is shown right here. There was only 20 people at his funeral in 1883. Ingalls was there and spoke, and the grave plot is very simple as he had wished. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that in the middle, towards the middle of the end of this cemetery plot is a glass house. So you might be wondering why in the world there would be a glass house built in a cemetery. Well, as I said, the cemetery was owned by a private company when it first was built, and it switched hands many times, and there has been a lot of damage in the war. Nobody was able to keep the cemetery up in terms of its upkeep. So an American architect actually said that he would build a glass house if he could live there. He actually does live there, and he would donate a large sum of money to the cemetery, which they did accept and let him build that. The current owners, who are a small group of a nonprofit and volunteers. The glass house, I don't know why you'd want to have a glass house in a cemetery, but I know that the themes of this house were both presence and absence, which you might get an idea as you look through. Walking around again towards the middle of the end of the cemetery, you will notice a lot of really interesting gravestones. There's a full-size piano. There's this of George Wombell. He was a menagerist. He had a lot of wild animals that were exotic, like this lion who now sleeps by his side and watches over him. So they say when you're volunteering that you would meet a lot of friends, and I found that to be true in my case, which might not be surprising, but what was surprising is that all my friends were dead people. So as I walked around and got to know George Eliot, who is actually Marianne Evans, who was the author of Middlemarch, very famous 18th century author. She wasn't allowed, well, she was allowed to use her real name, but it wouldn't be taken seriously as a woman in that time. And then there's pretty much one of my favorites, and isn't this beautiful? This is George Holyoake. George Holyoake is the founder of the word secularism, jingoism, and he founded the cooperative movement. When I saw that statue, I was intrigued by the beauty of its carving and the marble, and I kept going back to it and learning more about who he was and what he did in his lifetime. And so as you finally come to the very end of this cemetery walk, you find that you're at the beginning again of the cemetery because it is circuitous, it's very rounded. And I hope that you all have enjoyed taking a look at this cemetery that I volunteered and enjoyed seeing it and learning about it as much as I enjoyed working there.